your call? Well, the next question is, what's the worst hand I should call here? So here's the answer. Believe it or not, the range you should call here with is something like very close to the range that he's shoving with. It's not quite there. We're not talking about 5-4 suited or anything. But the break-even point, if we think he's shoving it that exact range, is something like Queen 5 suited, Jack 9 offsuit, King 5 offsuit, that general area. I just outlined the lower borders for you. Any hand better than that should also be called with. Now, clearly, we're not actually going to call here with King 5 offsuit. For one thing, we could very well be wildly wrong as to what he's pushing. For all we know, he's a nit and he'll only shove any pair and, like, any ace, and that's it. And at that point, our ranges are going to be well off and we're going to lose a lot of chips on average. Still, we should definitely be calling with hands like, with any ace, it isn't really close. Certainly with any pair, it isn't close either. Even though it's for like 40% of our stack, we don't have a choice. The basic fact is he's shoving here with a lot, and we're going to have to call with a lot. It's not close. In fact, some guys who are successful, like Bodagari, are going to call here with like any king. And a good percentage of the time, they're even right. So certainly, most of you guys do not defend your blinds enough. That's one of the things that a lot of pros will effectively do. And you should pay attention to that. Anyway, also the outcome here is you can suck out hardcore even if he happens to flop a set, which the replayer, for some freak reason, gets wrong here. Alright, moving on to the next hand. Alright, so next hand, fairly standard. I raise, small blind calls, and then donks into me for about 2/3 of the pot on that board. I see a bunch of people shove here. I do it myself, but I think it would probably be a good idea if you kept it to like 1/3 of the time or less. Basic reason is this particular board plus that particular bet size is a guy that has some kind of medium pair, would love to fold his hand, but very often is not actually going to be able to do it. You've got about you've got about 25% equity against his very, very likely hand of 7s through 10s or so. If you're shoving, it's definitely as a bluff. He's not really doing this with too many worse hands, especially because you have the ace of diamonds. And the fact is, a bunch of these guys are basically betting to see where they're at, and then when you shove, they're like, but I have an overpair, I call anyway. Now, if this board is a little bit nicer, like if it's 3 to a wheel, I like a shove way more because they do fold sometimes, and when you're called, you have more equity. But on this particular board, I just fold, which is what I did. Next hand. A few hands later, I get moved tables again, and at a new table where I don't really know too many people, I raise under the gun, get called in 2 spots. Oddly enough, the big blind is one of the callers, and he basically spends 1/4 of his chips pre-flop. Obviously, terrible play, so by this I already know he's pretty bad. And I hit my middle set. What do? Big blind checks. One thing that I do here a lot is check because I'm like 70 to 80% sure that if it gets checked through, the big blind will shove the turn. With guys like these that call off like 1/4 of their chips, a lot of times they're exactly the kind to try hopeless bluffs on a turn where everybody shows weakness on, or maybe not so hopeless bluffs, whatever. His stack size is pretty good for it, but in this case, it's going to backfire on him. I don't mind it getting checked through too much. There is a 2 flush, but that in itself is not a reason to worry too much. If the guy behind me has a 2 flush, he'll frequently bet it and I can check shove. If the guy behind me has an ace, he will almost always bet it. If nobody has an ace, then I'm better off not betting this flop and hoping that one or the other of them will take a stab at it on the turn, probably the big blind. And really the only draws I'm afraid of, other than the one flush draw, are things like gut shots, and most of the gut shots aren't really active on this board either. It's really hands like Jack 10 and maybe 6-5 from Monster that are the only real worry here. All of the Broadway hands don't even have a gut shot. 10-8, the only real straight draw, and 8-6, neither are really likely. And it's just a nice board to try a one-street slow play on because of the fact that if they do have hands, over the next two streets you'll still get them both all in if you want to. Anyway, I check. Perfect outcome for me. The guy bets the other guy's stack. Short stack calls all in. I tank for a little while and shove and get called, and they're both drawing nearly dead. And I basically almost triple up on a very nice hand, in a very nice spot. Okay, next hand is quite a bit later, so we're going to fast forward a little bit. Okay, next step. 5-bet stack about a half hour in. I think I went fairly card dead towards the end of this. Shoves under the gun. Folded to me in the big blind. Obviously, we are not only calling with Queen 10, we are snap calling. Again, the question is, what kind of hands are we generally calling with here? If we were getting 2-1, I would just call basically any two. I'd fold maybe exactly like 7-2 offsuits or 3-2 offsuit, and then like maybe the bottom like 5% of all hands. I'd call the top 90% or so. Since we're only getting 1.7 to 1, I tend to fold something like the bottom 15-20% of hands. I'm not calling exactly 3-2 suited. I'm not calling a small handful of other hands. And I'm not calling anything that completely ruins my table image to people that might not know any better. So there are a few hands I fold here. On the other hand, something like the top 80% total snap call. For that not to be true, he'd have to be shoving less than the top 40% of so of hands. And there's simply no way that he's going to be folding any kind of a decent hand under the gun here if he's halfway good. In this type of tournament, there are people that do fold a lot of those hands that they should be shoving, and you should be aware of those. But by default, I tend to assume they're at least marginally competent here and that they're shoving quite a lot. Anyway, good hand, pretty bad outcome. It happens. Next hand. The final hand of the tournament. A short time earlier, I was crippled pushing ace-jack into queens. In the immortal words of Forrest Gump, shit happens. That's okay. Anyway, I now have about 5 bets. Folded to middle position, who shoves effectively the same amount as I have. Another pot odds question, getting 1.6 to 1, what do you call with? Bottom line, this is once again a snap call. Almost any 2 live cards here are a good call. I would fold 8-3, I would fold 10-4, but anything halfway plausible and anything that is reasonably unlikely to be dominated is definitely a call. Especially on the bubble, which this is, I think, fairly close to. When you can't limp into the money, you do want to double up or go home, get some maybe folding equity for your shoves. While this is not a great spot, certainly I think you're better than 38% against a hand, against whatever he's shoving with. There are quite a few other hands where you're better than 38% that would surprise you. I would do the poker stove for his likely range, and you know, this is not something that I can spoon feed over one video or even 10 videos. But I encourage you to play around with stove and to figure out exactly what kind of hands you should be calling with here. I guarantee you it's wider than you think. Okay, and by the way, against ace-jack, I have just about the right odds to call anyway. Even if I knew he had that hand, I would probably be right calling. If I'm wrong, I haven't done the stove myself. It's by 1 or 2% either way. All right, that takes care of our tournament.